They said it with a smirk designed to look like a smile, a sentence sharpened by centuries, and tossed like a paper airplane across a conference room. Maybe you should go back to Africa. The words hung there, casual and catastrophic, the way some people learn to make violence sound like advice. He was standing beside a slideshow. He had spent nights perfecting charts in the right colors, forecasts honest enough to earn trust, a customer map that stretched beyond state lines. On the next slide was the sentence he had been waiting to. Say, we can go global. In the corner, a junior rep looked down, embarrassed by the familiarity of it. A manager coughed into a fist. Someone laughed too quickly. He clicked his remote and the screen changed, but the room didn't. The projector hummed. His throat tightened. He considered the instinct he had been taught for moments like this smile. Deflect. Keep the door open for the next meeting in. Found it suddenly, completely inadequate. This story doesn't end where those words intended. It begins in that room and heads in the opposite direction. It is about a boy who loved maps and a man who learned to redraw them. It is about a life lived between languages that taught him how to hear what wasn't being said. It is about the unromantic work of building, contracts and cargo, compliance and courage, deals signed under flickering lights, wire transfers that cleared just in time. It is about a business that started on a cracked desk with a borrowed laptop and grew tendrils across oceans, creating jobs, lifting suppliers, changing expectations. And yes, it is about a return he did, in a way, go back to Africa. But not as exile, as partner, as investor, as someone who took the words they used to push him out and used them instead as an invoice, payable on delivery of a global plan that would outlast smirks and outgrow small rooms. He grew up in a city that smelled like rain rinsing red dust from rooftops, where the market opened at dawn with a chorus of bargaining that sounded like music if you stood at the right distance. His mother could slice mangoes with a paring knife like a sculptor, and his father, an accountant with patient eyes, taught him to write numbers in straight columns because he said numbers deserve dignity too. He was the eldest of three, which meant he learned responsibility the way other kids learned lullabies, by repetition, by being told to watch the pot, to check the door, to keep the peace. His grandmother wore a head wrap the color of sea glass and kept 2 rules posted on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a rooster. Keep your receipts. Bless your food. His first geography lesson was the map on the wall in his classroom, Africa, rendered in colors that made countries look like puzzle pieces waiting to be reunited. He traced routes with a finger. Cocoa from here, copper from there, cotton from somewhere else. Ships traveling routes that felt too old and too new at once. He won a scholarship to a secondary school across town and took 2 buses to get there. Feet planted wide on the floor of a minibus that lurched like it had its own opinions. He loved math because it made sense even when nothing else did, and he loved stories because they made everything else bearable. At night he read textbooks under a mosquito net, highlighting lines until his pen ran dry. When the visa arrived, stamped and formal and miraculous, he ironed his shirt twice and packed 1 suitcase so carefully the zipper side shut like a satisfied guest. The airport was a fever dream of goodbyes, plastic-wrapped bags, last-minute prayers, jokes meant to hide the fear of leaving. He landed in a place where winters bit through coats, and people asked about his accent like it was a tourist passing through. He learned to file taxes and pronounce certain vowels flatter, learned to work 2 jobs and study at night, learned that some silences are full of grace and others are full of seeing you, not seeing you. He learned that the words overqualified, culture fit, and green card could form a vice if they wanted to. He found a mentor in a logistics manager who cared less about how you sounded and more about whether the pallet arrived dry and on time. He found a church basement where newcomers swapped tips about navigating forms. He found a grocery store that carried tastes from home stacked on the top shelf. A treasure map reachable by step stool. He found a long corridor of rejection silent. No's that came in the form of "we'll be in touch," or "the committee had concerns," or "we're not sure the market is ready." He did not find an apology. He did find a talent. He could see roots where others saw walls. He understood customs paperwork the way some people understand poetry cadence. Implication, the trick of what matters being hidden in a footnote. He knew how to talk to a factory foreman at 4 a.m. and a harried buyer at 4 p.m. How to convert between currencies and cultures without anyone feeling they had been shortchanged. He began to draw, not pictures, plans, arrows across oceans, timelines that acknowledged monsoons and holiday seasons. A thesis: the things our communities make can move not with extractive speed, but with durable care and profit, too, if we dare to insist on it. The racial climate around him wasn't a storm so much as weather. Sometimes a drizzle you barely noticed because you were used to being damp. Sometimes a sudden gust that snatched your hat from your head. A customer joked about scams when he saw an African bank name on an invoice. A colleague complimented his English in a way that suggested he had borrowed it and should return it promptly. A manager's smile stiffened when he suggested involving a supplier whose name she could not pronounce on the first try. There were good people everywhere, to be sure, and he gathered them like seeds. But the hum persisted, difference framed as deficit, belonging framed as permission, creativity framed as risk when it came from certain mouths. He learned to name it without letting it grow roots in his chest. The room had glass walls and a view of a parking lot that could have been anywhere. He had been invited to pitch a regional chain, modest, respectable, big enough to matter, small enough to be nimble. He had done his homework: store formats, buyer bios, the old quotes they liked to repeat in articles about culture. He had a deck that sang without screaming. Margins, shelf velocity, landed costs, logistics that would keep their DC smooth. He had, most importantly, a supplier network ready to roll artisans and small manufacturers across 3 countries on one coast, and 2 in the interior, all vetted for quality and labor practices by a nonprofit partner who answered his calls even on Sunday, because she believed in the long game as deeply as he did. The first 5 minutes went as expected. The small talk. The coffee he didn't drink. The question about the weather in a country that had never seen snow. He clicked to slide 4, category growth, with a line that rose like a promise. The buyer asked about chargebacks. He answered with a plan to absorb them for the first 2 quarters. The merchandising manager asked about packaging. He had mock-ups that met their brand guidelines with room for a story on the back panel QR. Code linking to a factory tour that wasn't propaganda, just pride in the moment. A senior VP who had been silent flicked through his printed deck as if he had dropped something sticky between the pages. He didn't look up when he spoke. "I don't want to be the one to say this." He began an opening that always means someone is about to say it. "This all sounds very ambitious, but maybe a better fit for you might be back in Africa?" He smiled the way people smile when they have just tested a boundary and found it weaker than they hoped. No, local markets. The room shifted, just slightly, into that pose people take when they decide to let harm pass through because stopping it would be inconvenient. He felt the heat rise up his spine and did not blanch it into a grin. He heard his grandmother in his head. "Keep your receipts." He made one on the spot. Calmly, precisely, he asked, "Are you declining because of our supply origin? Or because you think our plan won't sell in your stores?" He forced the fork. "Illegal or incompetent?" The VP blinked. No, nothing like that," he said. quickly looking around for witnesses who might agree. Just sustainability, travel, logistics. You must prefer to be closer to home. He let the silence grow a tail. The buyers shifted in their chairs. He continued, voice level. Home is here, and there. That's the point. The best way to reduce risk is to spread it wisely. The best way to reduce cost is to eliminate waste you're currently paying for. And pretend not to notice. He clicked to the next slide. A pilot path in 3 cities with similar demographics. A promo plan built with diaspora community groups whose events could move pallets instead of cases. A returns policy that didn't. Punish the retailer for taking a chance on something new. He did find a talent. He could see roots where others saw walls. He understood customs paperwork, the way some people understand poetry cadence. Implication, the trick of what matters being hidden in a footnote. He knew how to talk to a factory. Foreman at 4 a.m. and a harried buyer at 4 p.m. How to convert between currencies and cultures without anyone feeling they had been shortchanged. He began to draw, not pictures, plans, arrows across oceans, timelines that acknowledged monsoons and holiday seasons. A thesis. The things our communities make can move not with extractive speed, but with durable care and profit too, if we dare to insist on it. The racial climate around him wasn't a storm so much as weather. Sometimes a drizzle you barely noticed because you were used to being damp. Sometimes a sudden gust that snatched your hat from your head. A customer joked about scams when he saw an African bank name on an invoice. A colleague complimented his English in a way that suggested he had borrowed it and should return it promptly. A manager's smile stiffened when he suggested involving a supplier whose name she could not pronounce on the first try. There were good people everywhere, to be sure, and he gathered them like seeds. But the hum persisted, difference framed as deficit, belonging framed as permission, creativity framed as risk when it came from certain mouths. He learned to name it without letting it grow roots in his chest. The room had glass walls and a view of a parking lot that could have been anywhere. He had been invited to pitch a regional chain modest, respectable, big enough to matter, small enough to be nimble. He had done his homework, store formats, buyer bios, the old quotes they liked to repeat in articles about culture. He had a deck that sang without screaming, margins, shelf velocity, landed costs, logistics that would keep their DC smooth. He had, most importantly, a supplier network ready to roll artisans and small manufacturers across 3 countries on one coast, and 2 in the interior, all vetted for quality and labor practices by a nonprofit partner who answered his calls even on Sunday because she believed in the long game as deeply as he did. The first 5 minutes went as expected. The small talk. The coffee he didn't drink. The question about the weather in a country that had never seen snow. He clicked to slide 4. Category growth with a line that rose like a promise. The buyer asked about chargebacks. He answered with a plan to absorb them for the first 2 quarters. The merchandising manager asked about packaging. He had mock-ups that met their brand guidelines with room for a story on the back panel QR. Code linking to a factory tour that wasn't propaganda, just pride and the moment. A senior VP who had been silent flicked through his printed deck as if he had dropped something sticky between the pages. He didn't look up when he spoke. I don't want to be the one to say this, he began an opening that always means someone is about to say it. This all sounds very ambitious, but maybe a better fit for you might be back in Africa? He smiled the way people smile when they have just tested a boundary and found it weaker than they hoped. You. No, local markets. The room shifted, just slightly, into that pose people take when they decide to let harm pass through because stopping it would be inconvenient. He felt the heat rise up his spine and did not blanch it into a grin. He heard his grandmother in his head. Keep your receipts. He made one on the spot. Calmly, precisely, he asked, are you declining because of our supply origin? Or because you think our plan won't sell in your stores? He forced the fork. Illegal or incompetent? The VP blinked. No, nothing like that, he said, quickly looking around for witnesses who might agree. Just sustainability, travel, logistics. You must prefer to be closer to home. He let the silence grow a tale. The buyers shifted in their chairs. He continued, voice level. Home is here and there. That's the point. The best way to reduce risk is to spread it wisely. The best way to reduce cost is to eliminate waste you're currently paying for. And pretend not to notice. He clicked to the next slide, a pilot path in 3 cities with similar demographics. A promo plan built with diaspora community groups whose events could move pallets instead of cases. A returns policy that didn't punish the retailer for taking a chance on something new. The junior rep who'd been quiet cleared her throat. I'd like to see the factory tour, she said into the small vacuum that had formed. He handed her a tablet. She watched, and while she watched, the room did what rooms do when confronted. By unfunny truths. It pretended the moment hadn't happened. The VP's smile set like concrete. They thanked him for coming. He shook hands and walked out into a hallway that smelled like copier toner and expensive cleaning fluid, and the kind of fear that slows a company down dot in the elevator. He did not cry. He did not rage. He wrote himself an email from his phone, with the subject line, receipt. He typed what was said, who was present, who looked away. He emailed a mentor whose scowl could curdle milk and who would call him later and say, you're playing in rooms that are too small. Build your own. He didn't file a complaint. Not because he thought it wouldn't matter. Sometimes it does. And sometimes it resets a room, but because he recognized the contours of the problem. A gate that would not only keep him out, but keep the gatekeepers in. He would not win this company. He would win the market around it. That night, he pulled the deck apart and rebuilt it as something else. Not a pitch to one chain, but a plan to go direct at scale. He dusted off an old idea he had shelved because it felt too big for his little desk. A cross-border platform that didn't just sell products, but choreographed a supply chain aligned with values and velocity. Not charity, not pity. Profit and dignity braided tight. The first calls were to people he trusted. A freight forwarder who could get containers moving with fewer headaches. A software friend who could build a lightweight MVP of an ordering portal in a weekend. A diaspora community organizer who could fill a launch event with 300 people who would bring friends if the food was right. The next calls were to the suppliers he knew were ready. He told them the truth, that he had been insulted, that he was done asking for permission to build something he knew would work, that he wanted to do it with them, not for them, and that his demands would be as high as his promises. They didn't tell him to calm down. They told him to send specs. Within 6 weeks, he had a pilot, 3 product lines, 2 cities, 200 pre-orders through a scrappy portal that crashed twice the first day, and then held steady like a boat that had found its balance. He negotiated. Warehouse space month to month, the kind with a leaky roof and an owner who cared only that the check cleared. He hired drivers on contract and hired them full-time when it became obvious this was not a fling. He visited factories and filmed. Quiet videos, no swelling music, no preaching, just hands turning raw into finished, paint drying, boxes snug along seams. He paid on time. He studied returns not as failure, but as intelligence. He learned the particular humiliations of customs, paperwork, and the particular joys of watching a pallet you packed on one continent slide into a storeroom on another. He slept on an air mattress in the warehouse the night a storm was predicted and woke to the sound of water in the gutters and not on his boxes, which felt like a benediction. He made mistakes, misestimated demand for a flavor in one city, underpriced a shipping lane by 50 cents per unit, and had to eat it. Then made corrections and rolled the new knowledge into the next run-out word, spread the way it always has. Through aunties and WhatsApp, through small business forums and chance encounters at farmers markets, through a photo posted by a customer who found a taste of home on a shelf and cried quietly in the aisle. The pilot cities sold through. The second run sold faster. Growth is not a montage. It's a calendar. He learned to live by one, each square filled with what to move, who to call, which fire could be put out by email, and which needed feet on the ground. Financing was the sore tooth he had to learn to live with until he fixed it. Banks loved his forecasts and frowned at his passport. He kept a spreadsheet that doubled as a prayer list, invoices aging like milk, investors circling like hawks, friends who could front cash for 7 days because they trusted him, not because the numbers looked pretty. He swallowed pride and asked for help, then paid people back to the day and asked again, which he realized was its own curriculum, in humility and community. He hired early and often for character, then taught the rest. A picker who showed up first and left last because he liked the quiet of the warehouse. Before dawn became a manager who could count inventory by the sound of a pallet jack. A customer. Service rep who knew how to listen for what a person wasn't saying became the person who saved accounts that looked like losses. A driver who loved shortcuts too much learned to love routes that made sense for traffic and for temperament. He paid better than the warehouses around him because he wanted people to stay. They did. He faced the headwinds every immigrant founder learns too well, quoted jokes about exotic goods, landlords who asked if there would be too many people coming and going, city inspectors who let a tape measure bend into a threat. He faced the headwinds every black founder learns too well, assumptions that his numbers were optimistic, that his timeline was naive, that his ambition was impolite. He moved through them, not above them, because pretending abrasion doesn't exist is a good way to get sanded down. He built an advisory circle instead of a board at first elders and peers who would tell him when he was being stubborn and when he was being steady. One, a retired buyer with an eye like a hawk and a heart like a grandmother's, taught him to write emails that got answers. Move the ask up, she'd say, tapping the screen with a manicured finger. Put the math where they can see it. Add the human at the end, not as bait, but as truth. Another, a trade lawyer who laughed like a kid and billed like a professional, guided him through Incoterms and indemnities, and all the teeth it can hide in a contract. He learned to translate anger into architecture. When someone said his suppliers were too far, he wrote a white paper about resilience, how domestic-only sourcing was not safety but fragility, how diversity in origin made a supply chain elastic, how thoughtful cross-border integration could strengthen local economies. On both ends, when a potential partner winked at African time, he built a dashboard that tracked on-time performance and returned the wink with data that made the joke die in the throat. When well-meaning people suggested charity, he showed them margins that were tight but not timid, and said, "This works because we insist on excellence, not because we accept less." He started flying back 4 times a year. Back, a word he refused to let be wielded against him, visiting factories, eating with families who had turned orders into stability, mapping capacity expansions that wouldn't break anyone. He sat under a corrugated metal roof in the rainy season and negotiated a lead time reduction that didn't squeeze labor, a miracle achieved with a new drawing process and a promise to co-finance a generator. He met a young engineer who had redesigned a piece of equipment with scrap and stubbornness, and brought her onto the call with a skeptical buyer who only believed in innovation when it spoke with a particular accent. watching the buyer's face change on screen as she explained. Torque and tolerance was one of the purest pleasures of his career. He joined coalition supplier diversity roundtables, diaspora business associations, city task forces that occasionally did more than issue reports. He applied 4-1-2 grants that required more paperwork than a passport, but provided enough runway to try bolder moves. He brought in a small impact fund as a minority investor, on terms that protected his mission and his margins. He learned to say no to money that came with strings disguised as ribbons. He learned to write the kind of memo that makes an investor say, "How soon can we wire?" There were nights when he slept on the office couch and woke to the smell of cardboard and hope. There were mornings when he wanted to quit because a single stuck shipment threatened to topple a month of carefully stacked lines. There were afternoons when he laughed like a man who had just discovered an extra hour in the day, like the first time a container cleared 3 days early, and the team went out for ice cream like children who'd found coins in a couch. He kept a notebook labeled Fuel, and in it he wrote down every small win. A clerk who expedited something because she felt seen. A customer who sent a photo of a shelf with a caption that said simply, "Look." He reread it on the days when the weather went bad. The email subject line was plain, International Expansion Inquiry. The sender was not. It was the same chain whose conference room he had stood in a year prior, the one with the view of cars and the echo of words that had tried to shrink him. Their new head of growth had stumbled across his pilot through a regional manager who had stumbled across his products in the wild and asked, offhand, "How did we miss this?" The head of growth wrote like a person who had learned to listen. He asked for a meeting and attached a deck, not unlike the one that had sat on the table last year, except now the logos on the case studies were his. He agreed to meet. Not for vindication. He had learned not to burn calories on that, but for opportunity. He walked into a similar room with different weather. The junior rep from last time was there, older by a year and steady by a decade. The new head of growth was there, sleeves rolled, eyes engaged. The senior VP was not. He took a breath, and before anybody could warm up with small talk, he set the ground rules. "I'm not here for a courtesy listing," he said. "I'm here to architect a cross-border program that will make your supply chain smarter, not just prettier. I'm here to talk about data, not diversity posts. I'm here to serve your customers so well they will teach you who they are, if you let them." The head of growth smiled like a person who knew when to get out of the way of a good plan. "Show me," he said. He did. He showed sell-through rates by zip code with overlays of community events. He showed lead time improvements, achieved by process changes, not by squeezing people. He showed error rates lower than category averages because he hired for care and paid for it. He showed return reasons analyzed until they turned into adjustments, until the reasons stopped recurring. He showed risk maps honest enough to scare and thoughtful enough to soothe alternate ports, alternate producers, insurance policies that didn't pretend to be parachutes, but would keep you from breaking both legs. "Let's talk about the part that makes CFOs blink," the growth lead said. "Working capital. Who carries it?" He answered without flinching, "We share it. We share the upside, too. You get speed to shelf and a story that isn't just a story. We get stability to finance growth without taking loans from people who don't care if the roof leaks as long as the check clears." They negotiated like equals, which was all he ever wanted. They built a pilot inside a pilot. 10 stores in 3 regions, then 20, and 100 if the numbers sang. They wrote a clause that would trigger capacity investments at factories. When certain thresholds were met, investments co-funded by the retailer, not extracted from the last dollar a worker could earn. They included a training program for store associates that didn't turn them into mascots for a cause, but gave them words and knowledge. so they could sell with pride instead of pity. They put a ban on certain marketing cliches because dignity is a KPI 2 dot. As they signed, the head of growth paused. "There's one more thing," he said. "We'd like to acquire the brand you built for this category, keep you on as CEO of the division, and let you run global." The room went quiet in that way. That means everyone present knows something is about to change shape. He thought about the warehouse and the storm and the early mornings and the note, labeled fuel. He thought about a chain of value that could be tightened into a fist or opened into a hand. He thought about how power moves through contracts and whose names end up on deeds. He didn't say yes immediately. He asked for time. Then he called his people the freight forwarder, the programmer, the non-profit partner who had answered on Sundays, the factory engineer with the scrap-built brilliance, the advisor who liked to move asks to the top of emails. They all said different flavors of the same thing. If you can set terms that protect the mission and grow the pie, do it. If not, you're already global in your bones. You'll get there anyway. He returned with conditions. Keep operations local where they are. Expand them with investment, not just orders. No dilution of labor standards. And an audit protocol that includes worker voice, not just clipboards. A carve-out fund for supplier upgrades that doesn't come out of future POs. An associate training program with bonuses tied to real outcomes. A 3-year runway where he remains CEO with a path to the parent company's board if targets are met. And a clause that lets him spin the division back out if the company strays from the principles inked into the agreement. The head of growth read the list, whistled softly, and said, "You don't ask small." He replied, "I don't build small." They signed in a room with no view, because views are for press releases, and this was a covenant. He held the pen the way his father had taught him to, between fingers that think about tomorrow. When the final copy slid into the folder, he thought not of the elevator with the email titled receipt, but of a container ship easing into port at dawn, and of hands, waiting at both ends, ready to work without being bent out of shape. The press release later would say a lot of words that mean growth in the language of people who count. The reality looked like this. A factory added a second shift at a schedule, negotiated with workers who knew best when their lives could accommodate it. A clinic in a supplier town extended hours because paychecks became predictable. A warehouse in his adopted city upgraded its lighting, replaced the leaky roof, and posted a schedule that made childcare easier to plan. A buyer who had once smiled through doubt wrote an email that began, "You were right," and attached numbers that made the compliment unnecessary. He became the person who got on planes to stitch new routes with old principles. He drank a lot of bad coffee and made a lot of good friends. He became the person who told executives in glass rooms that the future of their margins lay in reimagining their morals as methods, not as marketing. He became the person who told factory owners that global standards were not excuses for performative audits, but invitations to build something that would outlast both of them. He spent fewer nights on the office couch and more at his own table, where he cut mangoes the way his mother had and taught his children to bless their food with one hand on their hearts. He built a scholarship in his father's name for young engineers who could make machines speak new languages with old parts. He funded a logistics fellowship for students who wanted to learn how goods actually move, not how people pretend they do in glossy diagrams. He joined a city economic council and insisted on procurement targets that looked like the city's census instead of its C-suite. He went back to the church basement, where he had once swapped Visa tips and taught a class on negotiating terms that don't sell your soul. The chain that acquired his brand posted a video of factory tours that didn't tuck away mess or mistakes because pride doesn't need airbrushing. Store associates in 3 regions learned to sell with sentences that honored complexity instead of simplifying it into from far away. Customers bought because the products were good, and then bought again because the story reminded them. That goodness is often a communal act. He encountered a familiar face at an industry conference. The senior VP from the first meeting, now at a different firm, who raised a glass and said, "Looks like you found your market after all." He smiled politely and said, "We built it." Not unkindly, just accurately. The man asked for a card. He offered an email address reserved for partnerships that had outgrown their old habits. Maybe the man would write. Maybe he wouldn't. It didn't matter. The roots were laid. On a trip home, he visited the school where the map had hung like a promise. He brought a new map not of countries, but of supply chains, with dots where his suppliers stood and lines where the ships ran. He talked to students who wanted to travel and to those who wanted to stay about how both are forms of service. He told them the truth, that you can love two places at once without tearing yourself down the middle. He told them to keep their receipts and their standards and their rest. He told them to build things that make jokes die in people's mouths. Because the results are undeniable, they told him to go back to Africa and expected the sentence to be an end. He made it a beginning. He went back, forward. Across refused to accept the compass points as orders and turned them instead into options. He learned the oldest lesson new again, that the answer to exclusion is not always entry. Sometimes it is expansion. He did not chase a seat at the table. He built a longer one, then wrote a seating chart that made sense. What he wants you to take from this isn't a hero story. Heroes are lonely, and loneliness doesn't scale. What scales is a practice of insisting on excellence in places that have been denied it, of writing terms that keep dignity in the center of the page, of growing by weaving rather than by stripping. It's the discipline of receipts and rest, of learning when to convert anger into architecture and when to let it burn a bridge behind you because no one should be crossing it anyway. If you are holding a deck in a room that smells like toner and condescension, remember, you don't have to make yourself small to fit the room. Redesign the room. If you are the person in the room who knows a line was crossed and felt your mouth go dry, use it anyway. Say, "That's not acceptable here," and make the moment cost something. If you run a business, make it better by making it fairer, not the other way around. If you are a student tracing routes on a map, trace one that makes someone else's life easier at both ends. And if anyone tells you to go back where you came from, learn to hear it as proof that you are already farther along than they can imagine. Then keep going homeward and outward until the work itself answers on your behalf.